Welcome everyone to Flowing 101, a virtual lesson on debate's most important skill. In this video, we'll go through the basics of how to flow. We'll talk about tips for improving your flow and keeping it clean. And lastly, we'll have a chance to practice your skills and improve your flows for the future. So let's jump right in. So for starters, let's look through just the basics of what a flow is. So this, imagine here, is our piece of paper, and we're going to have this vertical, and I would suggest that a lot of people like to use, as well as myself, is legal paper, the long kind, just because the extra space gives you more room to keep arguments, because a lot of times, we'll have enough to get to the bottom, and then if it keeps going, if you need more space, you can always flip to the back. A couple things you'll notice here. First is to label what arguments are going on each page. So this page will only have the case debate. Then I'll have a second page for maybe the dishead or a counterplan or a critique. And so depending on each different off-case position in the round, you'll have another separate sheet for it. And the reason for that is as I'm flowing, and you can see I'm keeping it in vertical columns here. So for the 1AC, all of my arguments, I'm going to write argument 1. Then instead of going across the page to the right, I'm going to go down the page, and here's my argument number 2, and then I'll go down for number 3, and so on. And the reason for this is that when the 1AC is then read, if they read, for example, 2 arguments that apply here, they're talking about the same argument from the 1AC, I can now line up both of those so that I can see, okay, the 1NC responded here and there to my argument there. And so by flowing it across the page, or by having the speeches go across the page this way, as I go through the round, I can see, okay, in the 2AC, this is where the next argument was made there, then they responded in the 1NR right there, and so on. And so it helps us to sort of line up the debate as we move along through the speeches in a way that allows us to see the natural progression between them. You don't necessarily have to label the speeches beforehand, but if you're just getting started out, I would try to label 1AC, NC, 2AC, 2NC/1NR, and so on, because that helps to sort of set the stage and keep the sort of columns for where you're going to flow there. Some people even I've seen might draw the lines there just to give themselves sort of some lines to keep within, because I especially tend to have some messy flows, and so when you're just starting out, before you get used to writing this way, having these columns there can help give you sort of a template to stay within and keep it a little more clean for the rest of the round. Some other things you might notice is that there's spacing between each of these arguments. And the reason for this, we'll talk about on the next slide, has to do with how many arguments the team may respond with in the next speech. So like I said, spacing is all about when a team responds with multiple arguments. So for example, as we saw in the last slide, in the 1AC, if you make your first argument, the 1NC may have multiple things to respond to it with. So, because we leave a space here, the 1NC, I can flow this response and this response, and I can see that both of those line up to my first argument there without budging up, without bumping into my second argument there. So by leaving a space there, I can leave room to then flow the response to my next argument so that there's still room right there to respond there, even though multiple arguments were made there. So that's the key for why we leave that space there. And as you can probably tell from my wonderful drawing here, the recommendation I would give is that you leave about 2 fingers worth of space. So after you write your first argument, if you place 2 fingers, maybe your index and middle finger on the page here, then wherever that ends, I would make that the space for your next argument there. And it doesn't have to be exact, and it doesn't always have to be that perfect. In the middle of a round, you may not have time to lay 2 fingers out in between each argument, but that's about what you should aim for, starting with about 2 fingers worth of space until you start flowing your next argument there. And the reason, again, for leaving that space is all about responses. So after the 1AC, when the 1NC is read, and the negative team responds to these arguments, the helpful thing about flowing in these vertical columns is, for example, if all of these arguments respond to this one right here, my flow shows that. I can see that this argument, and this argument are all connected. They're all related because they're all lined up right next to that one there. And so the key to flowing here is organizing your responses so that they align with the argument that they are responding to in the speech before. And this is helpful because if I'm giving the 2AC, I can see that this argument, the first argument we made here, that they said 3 things. First they said this, second they said this, third they said this. So in my 2AC, I can know first to respond, and then respond. And so by lining them up, it helps me to keep the debate organized because I can see exactly how the argument developed in the 1NC. Now, one more trick here, one tip I would give, is that especially in the 2AC, I would give yourself a little bit of room at the top. So maybe don't start your flow right underneath there, maybe give a little bit of space there, and so on. So in the 2NC and so on, I might do that there as well. Because oftentimes, debaters will like to give what's called an overview here, which is sort of a summation of their argument overall, just a short summary, as well as some arguments about the impacts that their case might solve or that their disad might prevent, if it's the 2NC. And so leaving some space for the overview allows me to then flow my responses still where they align. So again, the key for leaving that overview space there is that when I do get back onto responding directly to these, I can still line them up exactly where they responded. Now, one trick you might have seen on the last couple pages is a couple pieces of shorthand text. And what I mean by that is shorthand is a way that we can either shorten words into shorter versions or acronyms to make it quicker for us to write. And there's a couple different sort of genres of words that you might turn into shorthand. And the best thing for developing a good system of shorthand, I think, is to sort of make it your own. You can use all of these for examples. Feel free to use any that I'm going to discuss here. But the key is that if you use it consistently, it gets a lot easier to recognize because you can write just a few letters, but you're familiar with exactly what those few letters mean. And so it's a little tricky at first and might take a little bit of time. But once you're used to it, and once you're used to the symbols and they've become your own, in the future it's a lot quicker because you may not need a key or you can use a lot less letters because you're so used to these symbols that you've begun to use. So let's look through some different categories of shorthand we could use here. The first is debate lingo type terms. So for example, these might be different parts of an argument, so like uniqueness of a dishead or inherency of an affirmative, or the impact for whatever scenario it is that you're discussing. All of these are terms that will come up quite a bit in the debate. When debaters are talking about these, they'll identify when they're arguing for the uniqueness or when they're talking about the impact. So if I can record that on my flow in a shorter way than writing out uniqueness every time, that's going to save me quite a bit of time. Personally, I like to use whatever the first letter is, so the capital first letter of the word. So for example, first letter, then I like to circle them just so that I know that it's, sort of a special term. So for example, uniqueness, I would often do U and circle it so that I know, this doesn't necessarily tell me what the argument is, but it tells me what part of a disad it's arguing about. So, I may not know, it could be any number of thousands of disadvantages, but if I write U with a circle, I know exactly what part they're discussing. Same thing with inherency for the affirmative. I like to use I with a circle. And again, this is up to you. If you prefer to just write U, or maybe you want to write UN for uniqueness or anything else, this is entirely up to you. I'm just going to discuss my system just to give you a starting point, and then you can feel free to, use what works for you and don't use whatever you don't prefer. For impact, because I used I here for inherency, I like to use a little exclamation point with an X there for impact, because that's a pretty unique symbol. And the impact, I definitely want to know when that's coming up in the debate round, so I used something that really stood out to me to mean impact there. The next type of terms that we might use shorthand for are things related to the topic. So these might change from year to year with the topic, or maybe if you, switch affirmatives, you might be talking about a different part of the topic. But these are useful ones because the topic is going to be discussed in some way in every round. So a quick one that you may have probably already seen already for United States federal government is USFG. And oftentimes debaters will just say USFG, so that one's pretty straightforward. This year, another one might be criminal justice reform, or CJR. And that's one that I've seen show up in literature also. So for example, if you're doing research, you might see the term CJR come up as well. That's sort of a term of art among people who do criminal justice, research and write literature on that as well. Surely there will be some other ones, but you can, follow the same formula or choose whatever you would like for those ones. Another useful one is advantage scenarios, especially because these often carry over from year to year. So economy, oftentimes people will call it econ, or maybe you want to call it EC, or whatever you would like. Again, you can pick. Hegemony often becomes hedge. And then climate change, I always liked to use CLC like that. That's another trick there, is even if it's not necessarily a term of art, I like to use sort of periods to show that I'm shortening a word. So for example, one thing that a topic term that might come up this year a lot is surveillance. Because that's a pretty long word, that's one that you might want to shorten there. So you could do maybe SRV period or SURV period. Again, it's up to you. But that's another trick as well, is that using just a few of the letters and maybe a period just so that you recognize that it's shortened is a great way that we can demonstrate that. And lastly is some action terms, as I think these are helpful to shorten as well, especially because there's some good symbols for these. So for example, maybe if they're saying that the affirmative would increase something, one way I like to flow that is with an arrow, showing that it'll increase it. Or oppositely, if it decreases something. If maybe the affirmative leads to something. And so some of these action terms, we can use arrows to demonstrate how that is going to change. Another one that I like to use is that if they're saying, key to is a good one. Something is key to something else. I like to put K2, key to there, or even just key, K for key for something. So that's another one. Some of those kind of debate lingo-y action terms. The affirmative is key to something. The affirmative leads to something. those are other good ones that you can use some shorter symbols for. So just a quick review of everything that we've seen. So let's assume that this is my flow here. Again, now that we've discussed all this, you can recognize some of the things we talked about. First, in the formatting, every one of the speeches is flowed in vertical columns, and then the next speech moves over a little bit across the page. You'll see the spacing in between arguments so that there's room for responses. Even if there's more than one, they can still line up with the one argument they're responding to. There's some shorthand here. So for example, criminal justice reform is decreasing now. We could even call this the inherency of the affirmative if you'd like. Again, however you want to flow that. And then just some other quick tricks. Whenever I'm flowing the cite for an affirmative or for a card, I always like to do name, comma, date. And then one thing I like to do is draw a line underneath if it's a card. Because if I see, okay, that's a card, versus if later on they make some analytic arguments and I look here, okay, there's no line underneath, so that tells me this is just an analytic argument. So that can help me identify, is there a piece of evidence going with that, or is that just an analytic, just something, an argument that they're making on their own? As well as if they are extending a piece of evidence, so maybe they're referencing a piece of evidence that they read before, I like to often use dash and then the author there, or maybe they'll say author dash whatever it is. Some people will even, I've seen, draw a line over to that, so they can say, okay, this piece of evidence, they've physically brought it now into that speech there. That gets a little messy, but it does help to see where things have moved in the, between speeches and then further over into the debate. And again, when you're flowing responses, you can see we're sort of lining up responses for each piece of evidence. So if this piece of evidence in the 2AC, they said this, okay, I see that they're right next to each other, they respond. And then the 2NC responded again, and so keeping it lined up there. So try to incorporate these into your flows. And one thing to recognize is that flowing is a skill that can always be improved a little bit more. And so even if yours don't necessarily look like this right now, that's totally fine. Just each time you flow, try to incorporate one more thing that we talked about. So if you're new to flowing, maybe start with just try spacing. Maybe don't worry about shorthand yet, and especially with like the lines for cards versus analytics. But maybe start with spacing first, and then once you get more natural with that, then okay, now we can start looking at shorthand. And once you get shorthand, then we can start focusing on lining up our arguments more. And so approach these little by little, and each time you flow, you'll improve a little bit more. So a quick overview of everything. In terms of formatting, we want to try to use vertical columns for each speech. Between each argument, we want to try to use about 2 fingers between so that there's space for responses. To help keep it short, because a lot of times we need to reduce the room that we're taking up, we can try to use shorthand to decrease the amount of letters that we're writing. And thirdly, the key with responses, with flowing responses, is that it helps keep the debate clean. If you can keep everything lined up on your flow, that's going to make it a lot easier for the judge to keep everything lined up on their flow. So that's it for our overview. Let's practice. On the next slide, we're going to do a flowing practice drill that's going to help us practice getting our flow set up, even if there aren't necessarily specific arguments that we're making at this point. So let's give that a shot. So for our first practice here, we're going to do what's called the playing card drill, which is a way that we practice flowing using playing cards, as you could probably guess. And the purpose of doing this drill is to help us that when we're first starting out with flowing, it's to help us remember to keep that spacing between our 2 points, even though we may not be writing out a full tag. And so even if we don't necessarily have, a long string of ideas to fill in, that we can quickly remember, okay, before I keep writing on the next part, let me jump down, here I write my next part, jump down, next argument, jump down, and so on. And this drill is pretty straightforward. All we're doing is we are recording. I'm going to read off a list of playing cards, and we just want to record which cards were read. And you can come up with any system that you would like. This is also a good one to help practice developing your own shorthand. So for example, let's say I did a practice round, and this is my flow from before, all these ones here. So I wrote 8S, maybe for 8 of spades, then 2 of hearts, and I used an H. Maybe you might draw out a heart instead or something. And then 7 of diamonds. Maybe I drew a diamond that time, or you could put a D, it's up to you. And then king of clubs. So for this one, I used a K for king. Again, it's entirely up to you. You don't have to use my system, but you want to pick something that makes it a little easier for you so that you can choose, so that you can write quickly exactly the number value or face value if it's a face card, as well as the suit of the card being read. I'm going to read off 10 cards for each round, and we'll practice. We'll do 3 more rounds. So we'll do a round 2, a round 3, and a round 4. Alright, let's get ready for round 2. Again, I'm going to read off 10 cards for this. Now, because I'm not on paper, normally if I'm flowing on paper, I'd have a little more room here. But since I'm not, I'm going to scrunch these a little bit. So I might write my first one here, and maybe my next one there. Remember, we do need a space still. So remember, on your paper, leave a space. Leave that 2 fingers worth of space in between each. It's going to look like maybe I'm not leaving as much, but that's just so that I can fit everything on here because I'm working with not a full page here. If I run out of room at the bottom, maybe I go all the way down, I'm going to jump back up here to start it. When you're actually flowing, flip to the back of the page. So if you're flowing in a debate round and you run out of room, you make it to the bottom, flip to the back of your piece of paper and keep going from there. If you start over at the top, you're going to mess up your flow for the next speech, which, as you can see, I labeled my next speech there afterwards. I'm going to start off slower for this round, so I'm going to give you more time in between, and then I'll speed up a little bit of how quickly I read the cards for each round. So I'm going to start, and while I'm reading these, you just listen, but in the meantime, I'm going to flow them as well. So as I'm reading them, I'm going to flow them on my column here. Don't look at the screen while I'm reading. Try to flow it on your own, and then when you're finished, you can go back and look at my flow at the end to see how I did it and then to make sure that you got everything. So, our first card, 10 of diamonds, king of spades, ace of spades, 4 of diamonds, 2 of clubs, 9 of clubs, 3 of hearts, 6 of diamonds, 8 of clubs, ace of clubs. Okay, so that's it for round 2. And again, just notice how I left not quite enough space as I should have. That's maybe like 1 finger compared to 2. So on your paper, this is more of what you're going for here, the 2 finger spacing. Again, it's just because I was running out of space as I went down that I sort of jumped back up here. All right, let's get ready for round 3. And this time I'm going to go a little bit quicker. Okay, again, I'm going to flow it on my flow, and now in this column this time. But again, don't watch the computer necessarily. Flow it on your own, and then check at the end to see how I flowed it as we went. All right. 6 of clubs, jack of hearts, 6 of hearts, 5 of diamonds, 7 of diamonds, 7 of hearts, 9 of diamonds, 8 of diamonds, king of clubs, ace of hearts. So that's it for round 3, and again, notice I'm still not leaving quite as much space as I should here, just because of the room that I have here. If that is starting to get to be a little fast for you, before you move on to round 4, I would go back and listen to round 3 again. So jump back in the video, and you can re-listen to it, try it again, see if you get any quicker that time. Make sure, check your habits, make sure you're getting them with space in between, and try to make sure that you're keeping them short, just maybe a number and a letter, a number and a symbol, so you're not writing out the full suit. All right, let's finish up with round 4, and this time I'm going to go even quicker. All right, Jack of diamonds, 9 of spades, 10 of clubs, 5 of hearts, Queen of spades, 10 of hearts, 5 of spades, Queen of hearts, Ace of spades, 2 of diamonds. So that one got really quick, and even I started, as you can tell, started to, my handwriting got a little sloppier with some of them. But again, I was able to keep up because even as I'm, finishing one, if I just know, number symbol, I can, keep listening as I'm writing the next. So listen while you're writing, and so on. Because even if you're a little bit behind, as long as you, keep up with the general sequence, and let's say even if I miss one, or I can't, I don't know what that says, on my flow, maybe I'll put like an X right there or something, because that's also a good way to know, that if you miss something that you can ask about in cross-X, or something to ask your partner if they got there, so that, because it does happen, we do miss things sometimes, we don't hear everything, but it's great to know where it is that we missed it, so we can go back and make sure that we don't end up, missing an argument because of that. So, same deal as last time. If this is pretty quick for you, rewind the video back to the start of round 4, and try it again. Even though it's the same cards, the fact that you're redoing it and your hand is moving and you're training your ear to listen to it, it's getting used to it a little more each time. So keep trying it. That's it for our playing card drill. But we're going to have a couple more videos where we'll have some practice with arguments, and then some rebuttals and debate rounds, so that we can hear people reading cards at slow and then medium pace, as well as speeches with both cards and analytics, to mix in some of the different types of arguments that will flow.